Well, once again, cybersecurity legislation is having a tough time in Congress. Yesterday, the Cybersecurity Act of 2012 was rejected by the U.S. Senate by a vote of 51 to 47. Any hope of moving this forward now lies in the hands of President Obama. His administration had already drafted an executive order, and now, according to a leak made to the Washington Post, is in the form of a directive, Presidential Policy Directive number 20. Again, there's very little that we know about this directive, but it may hold the key to understanding the future of cybersecurity and raises a whole lot of additional questions. First, what about that promise President Obama made nearly 4 years ago?
The way to make government responsible is to hold it accountable. And the way to make government accountable is make it transparent so that the American people can know exactly what decisions are being made, how they're being made, and whether their interests are being well served. The old rules said that if there was a defensible argument for not disclosing something to the American people, then it should not be disclosed. That era is now over.
So now is the era of transparency over? Was it really ever in place? And what will be the consequences of future policies made by the president and eventually by Congress? RT correspondent Liz Wall is live at the U.S. Capitol with more. Liz, what are you hearing from Capitol Hill about cybersecurity legislation?
Well, I would definitely say that there's a lot of frustration here on Capitol Hill. As you mentioned, the Cybersecurity Act of 2012 failed in the Senate, and this really was a last-ditch effort to get this thing through. That means cybersecurity is likely a dead issue for this Congress. As you had mentioned, it failed in it was defeated in a 51 to 47 vote. That is short of the 60 votes that was needed in order for it to pass. And what this bill would have done is encourage companies and the government to share information on cyber threats. It also would put in a number of standards, a number of cybersecurity standards in place. Now, this bill was opposed by many Republicans and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce that said that this would put too many regulations in place. You also heard concerns from privacy groups that say that this would result in internet eavesdropping. But this failure definitely is frustrating for senators that were hoping to pass it in this Congress. Here is Senator Susan Collins. She is one of the authors of this bill.
I urge our colleagues to listen to the wisdom of former Homeland Security Secretary Michael Chertoff and former NSA Chief General Michael Hayden. From the previous administration, from President Bush's administration, they wrote the following: "We carry the burden of knowing that 9/11 might have been averted with the intelligence that existed at the time. We do not want to be in the same position again when a cyber 9/11 hits. It is not a question of whether this will happen. It is a question of when."
Well, Senator Collins certainly isn't alone in her cyber fears. As we've seen, cybersecurity has been a very hot topic in Washington, not only here on Capitol Hill, but we heard from Defense Secretary Leon Panetta equating cyber threats as equating it to the threat of 9/11, also saying that cyber Pearl Harbor is looming if Congress or government officials do not take action on cybersecurity. It's really being hyped as one of the biggest threats to our country at this time, saying that cyber threats could cripple our infrastructure and cause widespread chaos and affect everything from the finance sector to communications. Now, this bill was backed by President Obama, and now that it's not going anywhere in Congress, it's likely that what's going to happen, as you mentioned earlier, Chrissy, is that he is going to issue an executive order. Here is Senator Lieberman for more on that, on what that would entail.
I have appealed to the president that if we're not able to act here, that he should issue this executive order. I'm very encouraged by the work done on it, and I'm confident that if we fail to act, the president will act. I think he has a responsibility to act, because if we fail to act, we're leaving the American people extremely vulnerable to a major cyber attack.
Well, you heard it from Senator Lieberman himself, encouraging President Obama to issue this executive order since apparently it didn't pass the Senate. So this is likely, it looks like this is what's going to happen. But interestingly enough, as we've seen, this just came out, even though it happened a couple of months ago, this just came out, a report in the Washington Post that shows that President Obama actually secretly signed an executive order also related to cybersecurity. And what this order does is enable the U.S. military to respond and thwart cyber attacks. But much of that executive order is still remains a secret. And of course, we have this other one that is in the works. So one thing is for certain. It's not going anywhere in Congress. It looks certain that because of that, it's going to be the White House that's going to step in here.
Yeah, and certainly a whole lot of people could potentially be affected by this, not piece of legislation, but a directive or piece of paper that the president signs without even knowing what's in it. Very, disconcerting for a lot of people. Liz, I do want to distinguish the Cybersecurity Act from FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. Many members of the Senate have hinted that they plan to reauthorize FISA amendments during this lame duck session. Talk a little bit about what's at stake here.
That's right, Chrissy. It looks like Senate does hope to reauthorize FISA. And it was this law was first enacted back in the 1970s. And since then, we've seen this law really expand. Back in 2008, there was an amendment under President Bush, the FISA Amendment Act. And what this did was allow the government, the National Security Agency, to monitor Americans' emails and phone calls when they are abroad. So essentially what that does is allows for warrantless wiretapping. So we really have seen this program expand. What's at stake? I guess what's at stake is our privacy. And because of that, this law has been challenged by the ACLU and other privacy advocacy groups that are worried about our right to privacy.
Liz, finally, I know journalist David Sanger wrote a book recently called Confront and Conceal and posed an important question that very few other people have been asking. He wrote this. He said, what happens when other states catch up with American technology, some already have, and turn these weapons on targets inside of the United States or American troops abroad, arguing it was Washington that set the precedent for their use in the first place. Liz, why do you think this hasn't been answered?
Well, I think it's this fear of other countries getting ahead and gaining ground in terms of being able to leverage their ability to launch cyber threats. It's this very fear that justifies, that gives lawmakers and the executive branch the justification to really beef up our cybersecurity and invest a lot of money into improving our cybersecurity infrastructure. And we've seen that it really is a top priority now in Washington because we want to be prepared for this, as we've seen a lot of scary rhetoric of what could happen if we are not prepared for a devastating cyber attack, whether it's from an independent terrorist organization or a foreign nation.
All right, RT correspondent Liz Wall live at the Capitol. Thanks so much.